You are not muted upon entry, so please mute yourself if you're not presenting.
Sorry.
It's all right. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and spotlight Yabi. I got you. And Milton, I got you.
Thank you. Well, hi everyone. I hope you've been having a good conference experience so far. I'm Yabi. I'm 18 and I've been with CYAN on the Youth Board of Directors for a year. And I'll let Milton.
Hi everyone, I'm Milton. I hope everyone still remembers me from that last presentation, but yeah, I'm 17 years old and I'm going into my third year on the Youth Board of Directors with CYAN.
Thanks, Milton. So today we're gonna talk about smoking in multi-unit housing. If you could go to the next slide, please. All right, so first let's define multi-unit housing. Essentially, it's any building that contains multiple residences joined by shared walls. So like you can see in the pictures there are several units, and although they're separate, they share some common walls. Could you go to the next slide, please? All right, and then smoke-free housing in particular refers or applies to freestanding residences. So it's important to distinguish this from multi-unit housing, which applies to residences with shared walls. So like I just said, there are common walls in multi-unit housing. All right, now I just wanted to ask, who has heard of secondhand smoke here? Feel free to drop an asterisk in the chat. I'll demonstrate. I see some people already doing it. That's great. So looks like about 10 of us, 11 maybe, have heard, even more have heard about secondhand smoke. Okay, so let's go to the next slide, please. All right, so just so we're on the same page, secondhand smoke is essentially commercial tobacco or marijuana smoke that a person who isn't smoking inhales. It is both the smoke from the product and the exhaled smoke. So the smoke from the product is known as side stream smoke, and you can see in that arrow coming off of the cigarette, that's the smoke that comes from the burning tobacco product that doesn't enter the smoker's lungs. And then the mainstream smoke is smoke that's exhaled. So both of those combined constitute secondhand smoke. Next slide, please. All right. So now, who has heard of third-hand smoke? I am sure this is a less common, but it seems like a lot of people do know what secondhand or have heard of secondhand smoke. All right. This is one of the last definitions. Okay. So let's go to the next slide. So third-hand smoke is a toxic residue that remains long after someone smokes. And like you can see in the pictures, it's often visible as like a residue or coating, like you can see in that picture there on the walls, but it can also stick to ceiling fans. It can stick to ceilings. But it can be invisible on many other surfaces too. Like it can stick to furniture. It can stick to your clothes, your skin, your nails, your hair, and it's especially toxic for children, especially considering how many things they put in their mouth as part of their learning and development. So like you can see on that ceiling there, that's like a before and after sort of picture, before or after and before, I guess, after cleaning and before cleaning in a smoker's apartment. And then you can see that napkin, that soiled napkin, that's what comes off, the residue that comes off after years of buildup in a smoker's unit. Could you go to the next slide? Thank you. So last definition, Drifting secondhand smoke, which is sort of the crux of the whole presentation here, is smoke that can seep through electrical units, shared vents, plumbing, and more. So you can see here, even though they're separated by a wall, like we were discussing about multi-unit housing, even though they're separated by a wall, the wall is a common wall, so the smoke can travel through it. And then if you could, yeah. So, and here you can see the smoke traveling through vents, and you can see an electrical unit there in the corner. And you can see how the smoke travels to other units. So it doesn't matter if you're smoking in your own unit, the smoke can travel anywhere. All right.
So now I'm going to talk a tiny bit about the dangers of secondhand smoke exposure. And I think that's really important, especially after that great introduction by Yabby and those definitions about what secondhand and thirdhand smoke are. So next slide, please. So something really interesting and almost frightening to know is that the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, has reported that there is no risk-free level of exposure to secondhand smoke. So what that means exactly is that any exposure to secondhand smoke can be dangerous. It can alter your lung chemistry, alter your body chemistry, and it can lead to negative health effects. So with that in mind, it really emphasizes the importance of protecting individuals, protecting communities, and protecting those who live in a multi-unit housing from this secondhand smoke exposure, because it's so dangerous. Next slide, please. So now we're going to go into a tiny bit about the different dangers and the different health effects that may come about because of secondhand commercial tobacco smoke. So first and foremost, I think many people may have expected this, but secondhand commercial tobacco smoke has been known to also cause lung cancer. So it can have immediate negative effects on your lungs, and even a brief secondhand smoke exposure, such as one inhalation of a nearby cigarette, can damage cells in a way that sets the cancer process in motion. In addition, secondhand smoke exposure has many of the carcinogens, many of the cancer-causing chemicals that are seen in regular mainstream tobacco smoke. Some of those include hydrogen cyanide, which is used in chemical weapons, things like carbon monoxide, which you may know from car exhaust, and things like butane, which is also used in lighter fluid. In addition to causing lung cancer, secondhand commercial tobacco smoke has been known to cause heart disease and complications with the heart. It's been known to cause immediate effects such as coronary heart disease and stroke, and secondhand smoke exposure increases the risk for stroke by 20 to 30%, and it accounts for more than 8,000 deaths from stroke annually. So it really has an impact past the lungs, including the heart. And also specifically with children, secondhand commercial tobacco smoke has been known to cause something known as sudden infant death syndrome, also known as SIDS, which is essentially an unexplained or unexpected death of an infant in their first year of life. And SIDS is the leading cause of death in otherwise healthy infants. So it's something that secondhand smoke can cause and that individuals should be extremely concerned with. Next slide, please. In addition to those health dangers and those effects that I talked about on the previous slide, secondhand commercial tobacco smoke can also cause general harm to children. So for example, it can hamper lung growth in children, and it can leave them with more incidences and a higher likelihood of getting bronchitis or pneumonia. And also it's known to be a trigger for asthma attacks, and it can increase ear infections. And talking about asthma attacks, secondhand commercial tobacco smoke in general exacerbates underlying health conditions. So any health conditions you may have, especially if they're lung-related conditions such as asthma or even COVID-19, secondhand commercial tobacco smoke can make that exponentially worse. Next slide, please. So now we're going to be talking about a bit of a different thing, but it has a great connection to what we have been talking about previously. So now we're going to talk a tiny about secondhand commercial marijuana smoke. So currently there's a misconception that secondhand commercial marijuana smoke might be a bit safer than secondhand commercial tobacco smoke. But what we have to keep in mind is that smoke is smoke. So all kind of secondhand smoke, whether that come from cigarettes, vapes, or even commercial marijuana, all of that is going to be harmful, especially when inhaled in your lungs. You don't want any foreign foreign smoke going into your lungs and giving it that opportunity to alter your body chemistry and to harm the lung cells. So generally speaking, secondhand commercial marijuana smoke is chemically similar to secondhand tobacco smoke. So some of those chemicals that I mentioned earlier that are present in secondhand tobacco smoke are also there in marijuana smoke, and they behave similarly within the lungs. Secondhand commercial marijuana smoke can also impair blood vessel function. This is really worthy to note because, of course, your blood vessels are carrying the blood throughout your body, and they're really important for gas exchange and getting oxygen to your muscles and tissues, and also excreting carbon dioxide. So that can have negative effects on blood vessels. And also, secondhand commercial marijuana smoke, if inhaled by a secondhand smoker, a compound known as THC, which is present in marijuana, can be detected in those who inhale, even if it's secondhand smoke exposure rather than mainstream smoke exposure. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Milton. So now we'll talk about who's, we'll go into the victims of secondhand smoke. So let's ask who's especially affected. Within the unit, it's been shown to be children, pets, and plants, but every other tenant in the building is affected. Next slide, please. And now let's take a quick detour and ask who is most likely to live in multi-unit housing. These are people of color and lower income earners and people whose financial status prevents them from moving. So with this in mind, smoking in multi-unit housing is truly a multi-layered social justice issue. So it's that much more important to really work on this issue. Next slide, please. All right, and then just to reiterate the impact, secondhand smoke affects everyone in the building. When one tenant smokes, every single other person in the building can smoke. And next slide, please. To quantify this means that no matter, to quantify this, 65% of the air in a given unit has come from another unit. So no matter what a tenant's smoking habits are, they can still be forced to breathe secondhand smoke simply because they live in the same building as someone who smokes. They can be a complete non-smoker, never smoked a cigarette in their life, never let anyone in their house smoke. But just by virtue of living in an apartment, they can be subject to secondhand smoke. All right, next slide, please. Thank you. And now let's ask, what's the impact on a more macro scale? So 1 in 3 Californians live in multi-unit housing, and 21.2% of American youth live in apartments. These youth can't escape the third-hand smoke residue left by previous renters, nor the drifting secondhand smoke if someone is smoking in their building. Next slide, please. And then more broadly, 70% of multi-unit housing tenants do not live in smoke-free housing, though most would prefer to. So there's both a want and a need for work on this issue.
Sorry, yeah, I'm trying to go backwards, but it is not.
No
there
problem. We go. The slide
There you
back.
go.
One more, that way. Yeah.
There we
Thank
go.
you. And so here's a recent article published by UC Merced. They reported that smokers light up more cigarettes following the California COVID-19 lockdown order. And I'll go into this more on the next slide, but here's the QR code if you're interested in reading it, and the link will be in the chat as well. I can paste in there. Next slide, please. All right, so of course, as with many other issues, COVID has intensified or reignited people's smoking habits, as the UC Merced article reports. Tobacco sales have been before the pandemic had been steadily decreasing, thanks to tobacco control advocacy work, like the work that you're all doing right now. But during the pandemic, the Altria Group, which is America's largest tobacco company and the producer of Marlboro cigarettes, they reported that stay-at-home orders in the past year increased opportunities for people to smoke. Their tobacco sales plateaued, meaning that they were no longer declining. So if you look at this graph here, it's not the actual graph of tobacco sales, but it's a similar pattern. So before the pandemic, which is the the downward slanting blue line here, you can see that tobacco sales were decreasing, but then by virtue of people just buying more cigarettes and smoking more, that progress actually plateaued. So there's no progress as of right now. And then they also reported that they think this is due to people spending more time at home. So then they have more opportunities to smoke, and then they have more first, second, and third hand smoke exposure. So it's a much bigger domino effect than it may appear to be at first glance. And as Milton and Ria said in their presentation earlier, it's important to connect back to COVID if it's relevant. And in this case, it's very relevant because secondhand smoke exposure, in addition to first and third hand smoke exposure, they all lead people to be more vulnerable to COVID-19.
So now, after hearing about the dangers of secondhand smoke exposure and also who is affected by it, you may be wondering about the solution. So that's what we're going to go into a bit right now. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, there is no safe level of exposure to secondhand smoke. So the most effective and the best policy or the best solution to put in place in order to protect everyone from secondhand smoke exposure would be a 100% smoke-free policy, especially as it pertains to multi-unit housing. Next slide, please. So there are essentially two types of smoke-free policies that can be put in place as it relates to multi-unit housing. So there are essentially voluntary policies as well as policies that can be enforced by landlords and governments. So with a voluntary policy, this is essentially an agreement between a family or an individual or a group of individuals for them to practice smoke-free practices and essentially a 100% smoke-free policy. And of course, this might not be the same as a policy set in stone by the government or by a landlord, but this really helps to put social norms change into effect in order to change the culture around it. And additionally, the family engaging in a voluntary policy would essentially be protecting themselves from secondhand smoke exposure as well as mainstream smoke exposure. Next slide, please. So as I alluded to, landlords and governments can also create and enforce 100% smoke-free multi-unit housing policies. So these are essentially policies, restrictions, and laws that are put in place by landlords and governments. And what differentiates this between a voluntary policy is the amount of people it's able to protect. So in the previous example with a voluntary policy, if a family were to enact a voluntary policy and never have a cigarette, never have smoking within their own unit, if they lived in multi-unit housing, they could still be exposed to secondhand smoke due to that drifting secondhand smoke, as Yabby mentioned earlier. So about 28 multi-unit housing residents are subject to or are exposed to secondhand smoke in their home or apartment. And that secondhand smoke is coming from another unit, not necessarily their own unit. So if landlords and governments are able to create and enforce these 100% smoke-free multi-unit housing policies, every single tenant in their building will be protected from that secondhand smoke exposure. Next slide, please. And when we're talking about this, it's really worthy to note that smoke-free air is a right, and we have to keep in mind that right to health and how every individual should be able to live their life with smoke-free air. Next slide, please. And that's going to conclude our presentation. We hope you were able to gain a thing or two about smoke-free multi-unit housing. And thank you so much once again for your time. Feel free to drop any questions you may have as well into the Whova chat.
Yes, thank you, everyone. If you have any questions, we're more than happy to stay behind, but enjoy your break.
Great job, you two. I was comparing the chat, but the chat is not working while I'm presenting. Okay, and I'm not seeing any questions, so I think I'll go ahead and close it down for you all.
Are you going to the decision makers one now?
Yes.
All right. Okay. I'll see you there.
All right.
Question, sorry, quick question. Oh,
Oh,
hey, there. Hey, Milton.
Hi,
Quick,
I'm still behind.
hi. Quick question. So what would you suggest for a youth coalition? Let's say they're taking on this smoke-free housing objective, right?
Mhm.
So how would you suggest for them to because obviously there might be a lot of retaliation with something like this in regards to the people who, who live there, who do smoke. Or what are some recommendations that you can give for youth to prepare for something like this? Like if there are retaliations, like what can we say? What can they say coming from a youth perspective?
I think, of course, there's a lot of different information and statistics out there just looking, especially with California youth, about the impact that secondhand smoke has on them, and just the amount of youth who are subject to that, given that they live in smoke-free multi-unit housing. I think too, another great idea, if your youth coalition, we're looking into that. I think petition gathering is a really great tool to essentially show the support within the community. Because I think Yabi mentioned how there's an overwhelming support and demand for smoke-free multi-unit housing, yet those policies haven't been enacted in place. So I think within multi-unit housing that's currently not smoke-free, a majority of individuals would like smoke-free multi-unit housing. So like petition gathering would be a great tool just to show how much demand and interest essentially there is for smoke-free multi-unit housing.
Awesome.
Does that answer your question? Okay.
Yes, perfect.
Great, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course.
thanks, Milton. I'm gonna go ahead and start the next one. Start admitting people.
Sounds good.